So what I mean is when coming to create a game, I think it's important to think about the world story and gameplay as a unit. Think about how they work together, how the connections between them, and when combining them well in terms of style, atmosphere, and theme, they can really make a better experience for the player. First, I'll establish the terms. When I talk about world, I talk about the world in which the game takes place. And it can be a realistic or a fantastic world, but it will have some kind of inner logic, some kind of a law system inside the world. The story is a series of events that are connected somehow and create a narrative, and it happens inside the game's world. The gameplay is the experience of the player when interacting with the game. So it includes the game mechanics, the goals, the challenges, and the ways to fail and succeed in the game. So I'd like to start with 2 examples of games that I love a lot, and I think do that very well. So Braid is actually the first game that I've ever seen to do that. So it has a very special place for me in my heart. And the thing about Braid, the story in Braid, is about a guy who looks back at his failed relationship, and he wants to fix all of the mistakes that he's made during this relationship. So he's dreaming about a world where he can turn back time and go back to the point where he made the mistakes and fix them. That way he will learn from them, but avoid the consequences. The mechanic of the game, the gameplay, as you can see, is a platformer, but you have a special ability to rewind time. So at any given point, you can press a button and rewind time, go back to the point before it all went wrong, and do it over and over until you succeed. So what really amazed me about this game is how the mechanic and the story are actually about the same issue. They're about the same subject, and they approach it with different angles, and each with its own tools. Papers, Please is also an indie game where you play the immigration inspector at the border, and you have to decide which person get in and which one doesn't. You have to check their paperwork and see if it all checks out. So the story in this game is very, very integrated with the mechanics, because the story is really made of a lot of small encounters with the people that approach your window, and each of them has like a special story that builds the bigger plot. So what I think about both Braid and Papers, Please, that I couldn't imagine them being anything other than a game. I think the experience really, really benefits from these games being games and not another medium like, I don't know, book or a movie. So the question that I wanted to ask when I came to create my game is, how does using the game medium benefit the experience I want to create? Because I think, well, we know that games differentiate from like movies and books because they have gameplay, they have interactivity. So the player he's not a bystander, he's a participant, and it's a whole new way to experience the story. But what I want to talk about is how the gameplay itself can be a creative tool. Much like art or music that can take the story to many places, the gameplay also can be used as a creative tool. So I'm going to talk about my game, The Splitting. It's an episodic mystery adventure game. A little bit about adventure games. The adventure genre is, it's a game where the player plays a protagonist in an interactive story driven by world exploration and puzzle solving. So this is a very narrative-driven game. It has a strong narrative, and I wanted to create a wholesome narrative experience using also the world and the gameplay. So the main story of the main character in the game is about Daniel. Daniel wakes up one morning to find out that his reflection in the mirror has disappeared. When he reaches out to the mirror, he discovers that his hand passes through the mirror, and then he also passes through and he finds himself in a mirrored version of his own apartment. So from that point, you have to explore and see what happened, investigate the disappearance of your reflection, and discover both the characteristic of this world and the, I don't know, the characteristics of the splittings of what happened to you and your reflection. So I talked about the story, I'm going to talk about the world and the gameplay, and then I'm going to talk about how I try to combine and integrate them inside the game. So I think the world is urban fantasy or realistic fantasy, which means basically that the story takes place in our world, but I added some magical elements to it. So these are the 3 very basic elements that I have added. First, there is a parallel world, which is a mirror image of this one, which means there is a world all around us, a parallel world that is a mirror image of this one, and we can approach it through mirrors. But as regular people, none of us can do it because we all have reflections which physically block us from entering. The third rule is that sometimes a person can get split from their reflection, which means that they lose synchronization and the reflection wakes up, becomes an independent entity, and then this person can go through the mirror because nothing is blocking the way. So the gameplay is actually based on these laws. I really tried to integrate the gameplay with the world. So the puzzles in the game are based on understanding the laws and using them to your advantage. I tried to reveal the laws gradually so it won't be too confusing. And these laws create obstacles as well as solutions. So I will give a few examples for the gameplay, for the puzzles. The first one is based on a really basic characteristic of the world, which is that everything in our world, the real world, has a duplicate in the mirror world. And that's because the mirror world is an almost identical replica of this one. So in this puzzle, you find a flashlight in one of the drawers, in one of the worlds, and it doesn't have a battery. It has only one battery, and it doesn't work. So the solution is just to cross the mirror into the other world, pick up the flashlight from there, take the battery, and then fix your flashlight. Another puzzle, which also has a narrative meaning in this case, is this one. Daniel, as I already said, he investigates the disappearance of his reflection. We don't know where his reflection went. But in the reflections bedroom, we find a photo album, which has one picture missing from it. And, okay, when we go to our room, to the real world, we discover the same album with the picture is in there. So we take the picture, we gain an item, we're going to use it later in a puzzle, but we also gained a hint, a narrative detail, because now we know he took the picture, we don't know why, we don't know what's so special about it, but we know he took it. So, okay, I'll summarize a little bit the world and the gameplay and the connections between them. I think because the world's laws are not very intuitive and are a little complicated, and they get complicated in time, more and more complicated. So I think the puzzles help the player practice the laws and help them, the players understand better, because they don't only hear about the laws, they also get to experience them, and then they can understand them better. Also, each element in the world has a potential to be used in a puzzle. An example that also in an early stage, we discover that in the mirror world, rooms that don't have mirrors in them, they fall apart. So this cancels the first law, like in this room there won't be any duplicates of anything because everything is ruined, but it can also be a solution to something, because sometimes the wall falls apart and you can pass through to the other room, and you couldn't have done that if you had a mirror inside this room. So every new mechanic, every new law is actually a mechanic. It's like the same thing. Okay, the world and the story, well, this is, I think, more obvious connection because we have it in movies, we have it in books, but I still want to talk about it a little bit. When I thought about the world, when I started out making the game, I only had the world. I didn't have the story and I didn't have the gameplay. I just had these 3 basic rules. And then I started to think, what interesting stories could I find that could happen in such a world? So I chose the ones that I thought were both interesting, but also that I thought that were compatible with what I wanted to talk about, the issue of the game, of the story of the game. So what I wanted to talk about is like the relationship of a person with themselves. So each character, each of the main characters have a special relationship with their reflection. So through these relationships, they deal with very complicated experiences, grief, rejection, abuse, a lot of complicated feelings in which they try to solve through their reflections in many ways. So I think that the world's laws, in this case, allowed me to do that, to explore the relationships of people with their reflections. The main story, when I talk about story and gameplay, I want to talk about the main story because I think it's the most relevant. The story of Daniel, who starts out a blank slate. He doesn't know anything, wakes up in the morning, he finds out he doesn't have a reflection. So both him and the player are in the dark. They discover the world step by step together. I think it's also compatible with the adventure game genre because it has a strong element of exploring and discovering the world. So I thought this story was most compatible with the gameplay. Another thing that I tried to create is that not every, but some mechanical elements that we encounter in the game and we encounter in puzzles will later become narrative elements, that we are practicing these laws now, but later we will meet them as a narrative element. So I'll give an example that this is an example from the second chapter, so it's a bit more complicated. Okay, something you need to know that when a person has a reflection, his reflection is connected to him consciously. So the reflection doesn't see anything around them, they just see what the real person sees. So in this part, Daniel, he walks into a bar and it's in the mirror world. So it's full of people that don't see him and don't hear him, and he's like a ghost here, but he spills water on one of the people there, and he thinks that, well, he won't notice it. He's a reflection, he doesn't know. But this person starts saying, well, wait, isn't it chilly here? So we understand that the real person felt something. Some feelings and emotions can pass to the real person. So we are going to use this mechanic as like a problem-solving device in the next puzzles in the chapter. But we will also meet it later in the next chapters as a narrative element. Like it's going to have an impact on Daniel's life, like when he was, I don't want to spoil too much, but when he was like younger, something happened to his reflection that affected him in some way, and that caused later events, and that will be a narrative element. So I think that using the mechanic as a hint previously will make it a better impact later when we discover it as a narrative element. Okay, in the second chapter, we also have a new mechanic that we can change the situation of the room in real time. So we have a mirror, we can flip it, and then we'll get both situations of the room. Here it's ruined, here it's not. But if we change the mirror back, the room was ruined, but we return it to normal, it won't return to this stage. It will copy the real room. Okay, so the room resets when you reveal the mirror again. So This is a mechanic that is used in the second chapter a lot, and later also it will reveal itself as a narrative element when Daniel is going to lose something because someone reset the room, and Daniel is going to lose something forever that was in a mirror room but wasn't in the real room. So in conclusion, what I think is that when coming to create a narrative game, especially, or a game where the narrative and the world are significant, I think that thinking about combining the world story and gameplays is very important because these are the reasons. I think it creates a very unique experience because it's such an unexplored field, and you can do amazing things with it and create something new. Gameplay, I think, as a creative and storytelling tool is not fully explored, and I don't know. Well, another thing is that it adds depth to the story. I think in Braid it's very clear that it gives depth to both the story and the mechanic when they work together. And also I think it creates a more wholesome experience in general for the player. That's it. Thank you.
Hi. I'm just curious, did you get a chance to play Undertale?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's because it's really appropriate to what you discuss. So
yeah.
I was wondering.
I really like Undertale, but I don't know. Papers, Please, and Braid are like my fathers. I don't know.
All right.
What do you think usually comes first in the connection between narrative and mechanics? And do you think one is better? Like, there are games that, you know, mechanics based, and then they find the narrative to explain the mechanic, and there are games that work the other way around. So if you think one of them is more healthy for the game?
I don't know. I've heard different approaches. I think it really depends on the person, the creator, and when he comes from. I came from stories and from literature, so naturally the narrative part for me comes first, but not only like, I don't think it's more important. It's just when in my creative process. But I really think it depends, and sometimes the mechanic comes first, and sometimes the story. And I think what's important is that it's actually good that they both come together and complement each other and grow together.
So it doesn't matter as long as they work together.
Yeah. Okay. No, I think it depends on the creator.
I don't know if you said it in the start when I missed the beginning, but I wanted to know what is your part in developing this game and how many people developed it.
Okay. Well, I'm the developer, the artist, and the game designer, and there's also a musician that made the music, Asaf Alevi.
You talked about, I hope I didn't miss something. You talked about good examples, but can you give like a bad example of either a bad example of blending mechanics and story, or example where mechanics and story should have blended but didn't?
I don't know about specific games, but I think a lot of games, they don't do that. They don't think about it, so it's clear that, I don't know, the gameplay is strategy, and they like put a story on it, and it doesn't have anything to do with the gameplay. And it's also okay, but I don't want to say anything bad. It's also okay, but I think it's better for narrative games to do that.
Okay. Thank you, Stav.